Good morning, everyone, and a very happy Easter to you all. What a Lent we've had, right? But now, of course, we're in the Easter season. It began late last night, early this morning, and at least as I'm recording this, and I hope that you're all doing well. So, just to let you know, as a marker, I am recording this for April 13th, 2020, Monday. And again, I miss you guys, and I hope that you're all doing well. Today, we're going to jump back a little bit in our readings. In fact, I want to jump all the way back to begin with to page 559. Last week when I left you, we had been talking about progressivism and ideology, and in particular, we started thinking about that, I think, just profound piece from Whittaker Chambers, in which he tries to explain why is it that we have this kind of desire to become ideologues? What is it that allows people to kind of change their normal values, their normal virtues, and allow them to become a part of something very different than what they were? How are these things shaped in terms of, say, a false religion? And those questions are vital questions as we think about not only world history, but specifically here, American history. But I want to jump back a little bit and look at progressivism and nationalism. Now, if you remember, when we looked at that piece, The Eclipse of Liberalism, one of the things that the author of that stated was that too often we have exchanged our ideas of national brotherhood for national glory. And in fact, let's look at that again really quickly. If you'll turn, I know I just asked you to turn to page 559, but I would ask you to turn to page 578. So going back to Wednesday's class of last week. Down at the bottom, line 35 of 578, the Declaration of Independence no longer arouses enthusiasm. It is an embarrassing instrument which requires to be explained away. The Constitution is said to be outgrown, and at all events, the rights which it guarantees must be carefully reserved to our own citizens. Now, we've got to get this into context. One of the things that we find, if you remember when we talked about Frederick Jackson Turner, he had worried that because we were such a frontier people, that once our frontier was over, we would still have that boundless energy, and that energy would project itself in foreign expansion rather than in frontier domestic expansion. Now, there may be a very fine line between, say, invading the Dakotas and invading Hawaii or invading the Philippines, but it is a line nonetheless. And there's one thing to say that we can expand in contiguous land, and another in which we have to go through the sea, through the ocean, over huge boundaries to get to some place that is not contiguous with us. And at all events, the rights which it guarantees must be carefully reserved to our own citizens, not to the ones that we've just conquered. Remember the Northwest Ordinance, right? Any time that we move into a new territory, the citizens of that territory will enjoy all the common law rights, all the rights of American citizens, and they will not be second-class citizens. But with imperialism, and the imperialism that grows in the 1890s and the 1900s and the 19-teens, this imperialism is going to take on a very different shape in terms of what the American character is. We aren't going to allow those we conquer to become first-class citizens or to become our equals. Yet notice that Hawaii is an equal, but the Philippines most certainly are not. Cuba is not an equal, though Puerto Rico is close, but not exactly. And all of those were territories that at one time or another we invaded. So, they must be carefully reserved to our own citizens and not allowed to human beings over whom we have purchased sovereignty. The great party, right, the Republican Party, which boasted that it had secured for the Negro the rights of humanity and of citizenship, now listens in silence to the proclamation of white supremacy and makes no protest against the nullification of the 15th Amendment. Its mouth is closed, for it has become a patriot only in pernicious toils. And the present boasts of this champions of humankind are, then we get that great quote. And what does our author say after that? Nationalism, right? This idea that somehow the nation state is greater than anything else. nationalism, in the sense of national greed, has supplanted liberalism. It is an old foe under a new name. By making the aggrandizement of a particular nation a higher end than the welfare of mankind, it has sophisticated the moral sense of Christendom. We hear no more of natural rights, but of inferior races, whose part it is to submit to the government of those whom God has made their superiors. The old fallacy of divine right has once more asserted its ruinous power, and before it is again repudiated, there must be international struggles on a terrific scale. So, part of what our author here means is trying to get at is an argument that as we start thinking about invading foreign lands, the American character is going to change dramatically. So I want to give you a quote from my undergraduate advisor, Walter Nugent at Notre Dame. And Nugent, in one of his own books, I think one of his great books called The Habits of Empire, he's a little more cynical about this than what I would generally like to see in a historian. But at the same time, I mean, I love Dr. Nugent, don't get me wrong. He was an amazing advisor. But as he talks about this, he starts thinking that maybe there really is very little difference between an empire and a frontier. So he writes that when we look at Turner's suspicions, perhaps there was a connection. There was something in the frontier westward movement that instilled in the American people the habit of empire building. All along, the United States was a republic, but republic and empire have not always fit together, Dr. Nugent writes. Today, there is a good chance that empire might eclipse republic. Old habits can become unthinking practices. Thus, we have always been an imperial nation and remain so, but the shape of the American empire has shifted over time. Its present form is different from either our own past ones or historic ones like Rome or Britain. It is still developing. The three historic American empires have all rested on an ideology of expansion. Military solution overlain by rationales and high ideals have consistently been considered effective and justified. So I don't know if I'd go quite as far as Dr. Nugent in saying that we have always been an imperial nation, but there is no doubt that the time period that we are looking at right now in American heritage, that time period between about 1890 and 1920, what we call the Progressive Era, was a deeply imperialist time period for us. And it would be impossible to look at progressivism without also looking at the extreme expansion that the Americans embarked upon during that same time period. And not accidental. Think about what we've seen in the past. Think about Manifest Destiny, which was a form of progressivism, and what we did to Mexico during the 1840s. But now, in the 1890s, we're looking well beyond our immediate neighbors and our immediate frontiers, and we're looking at foreign powers as places for expansion. So, what do we have? Well, we have the Spanish-American War in the late 1890s, where the United States takes over Cuba and we take over the Philippines. One of the things we hardly ever talk about in American history is that we went into a 5-year guerrilla war in the Philippines beginning in 1898. And during that decade, that half decade, from 1898 until 1902, the United States lost something like 4,300 soldiers, and we took the lives of nearly 60,000 Filipinos. Yeah, this was basically our Vietnam War about 80 years too early, right? 70 years earlier. Amazing. And closer to home, right? We think about what the United States did in terms of our own invasions. We invaded Cuba, full invasions, in 1902, 1906, 1912, 1917, and 1922. We invaded the Dominican Republic in 1916, Haiti in 1915, Nicaragua in 1912, and Mexico repeatedly during Wilson's first administration between 1913 and 1915. Indeed, in 1914, we invaded the city of Veracruz, and this led to the death of about 200 Mexicans and the wounding of about 300 more. Right? We famously, under Woodrow Wilson, sent close to 11,000 troops into Mexico to take out the pirate folk hero Pancho Villa. Right? This went on for a full year, and this is our neighbor. I mean, can you imagine sending 11,000 troops into Mexico right now? And yet that was just a little over 100 years ago that we did that. So please don't think that what we see in the 20th century, especially what we see in the Cold War, is unique. We're going to start seeing America taking on a radically new character and persona during this progressive era between 1890 and 1920. And again, I can't stress this enough. There is no possibility of looking at American progressivism without also looking at American invasion. The same thing that was true in 1902, 1906, 1912, 1917, 1922, and so on was equally true under George Bush, especially with the invasions, our second invasion, both George Bush's, invasion 1 in 1991, and then again under Bush 2 in the early 2000s. So progressivism and our progressive presidents, right and left, it's always connected that when we have eras of so-called progress, we also have serious progressivism and progressive expansion. And it makes sense. We can't really have a large warfare state without also having a large welfare state. And we can't have a large welfare state without having a large warfare state. Big military, big government, and big welfare always go together. William Graham Sumner, if you'll turn now to page 559, William Graham Sumner was the leading historians of thought and of sociology in the late 1800s, in the late 19th century. He was a professor at Yale and an extreme opponent, to my mind, a correct opponent, but an extreme opponent of any territorial expansion at all by the United States. And in his own article here, which is an excellent article, The Fallacy of Territorial Expansion, if we look on page 560 to that only full paragraph on the entire page, right down there, beginning at line 24, what does he say? Territorial aggrandizement enhances the glory and the impersonal importance of the man who is head of a dynastic state. The fallacy of confusing this with the greatness and strength of the state itself is an open pitfall, close at hand. It might seem that a republic, one of whose chief claims to superiority over a monarchy lies in avoiding the danger of confusing the king with the state, ought to be free from this fallacy of national greatness. But we have plenty of examples to prove that the traditional notion are not cut off by the changing of names and forms. And there, William Graham Sumner is sounding very much like Walter Nugent. What have we done? We have taken all the forms and the ideas and the symbols and the notions and the deep meanings of the Republic, but we have shifted them. And just as the Romans did, we keep the Senate, but we now have an empire. We say we're not in favor of imperialism, but in the name of democracy or goodness, we have invaded not just our neighbor, but our neighbor's neighbor and our neighbor's neighbor's neighbor. And we suddenly think that this is something that we can get away with, whereas other powers have not been able to, but we've learned our lessons, and we think that we can be good invaders rather than bad invaders. Think about what happened with that second Gulf invasion under George Bush, where not only did we invade Iraq, but then we immediately sent policy wonks in with their pocket constitutions and declarations as though they were holy writ, holy script that once read would of course convert any people. Turn the page again, if you don't mind, to page 563, and I would like you to read all of this essay. But if you turn to 563, at the bottom there, to that last paragraph, the confederated state of ours was never planned for indefinite expansion or for an imperial policy. Again, I have to agree. with William Graham Sumner here. There is nothing in the U.S. Constitution to indicate that we were ever meant to be an empire. In fact, there's nothing in the Declaration, there's nothing in the Constitution, there's nothing in the Northwest Ordinance, and there's nothing in the Bill of Rights that would even hint at empire. In fact, everything of the founding is adamantly against an expansionistic empire in every way. And that means that our Constitution, our people, is based on an understanding that we will mind our own business. We might be a city upon a hill, but that city upon a hill does not take its fire to its neighbors. It continues to take care of its own fire and allow that fire to serve as a beacon if others are willing to watch. But that doesn't mean we take the fire and stick it under them and force them to change, right? That's a very different kind of thing. And yet we've seen, as we've talked about in this class, we've seen from crazy Lorenzo Dow up through the Mexican War, now to what we see and what William Graham Sumner is fighting, that there has been this strong tendency in American history to invade and impose our will on foreign peoples. Sumner continues there, line 29, page 563. We boast of it a great deal, but we must know that its advantages are won at the cost of limitations, as is the case with most things in this world. The fathers of the Republic planned a confederation of free and peaceful industrial commonwealths, right? These peaceful and free little republics. Each state is a republic. Shielded by their geographical position from the jealousies, rivalries, and traditional policies of the old world, which we finally thought that we had shaken off, and bringing all the resources of civilization to bear for the domestic happiness of the population only, for our own people, not to be selfish, but so that we aren't busybodies to the rest of the world. What actually gives us the right to tell others how to live? Clearly, we need to work on ourselves and not force our own understanding on the rest of the world. All right, does that fit with what we saw? Well, if you jump back, for example, to page 226, what did George Washington tell us in his farewell address? We want harmony, liberal intercourse with all nations. They are recommended by policy, humanity, and interest. But even our commercial policy should hold an equal and impartial hand. Right? Even in our commercial policy, we shouldn't pick favorites, neither seeking nor granting exclusive favors or preferences, consulting the national course of things, diffusing and diversifying by gentle means the streams of commerce, but forcing nothing, establishing with powers so disposed in order to give trade a stable course, to define the rights of our merchants and to enable the government to support them. Conventional rules of intercourse, the best that present circumstances and mutual opinion will permit, not temporary and liable to be from time to time abandoned or varied. Right? This is not up to us. We do not have the right to determine the fate of another people. We can save them, we can rescue them as we did during World War II, but we don't have the right to move into their house and to tell them how to govern their own house. That is not what we are made to do as Americans. We are meant to mind our own business. Right? So what do? Conventional rules of intercourse, the best that present circumstances and mutual opinions will permit, but temporary and liable to be from time to time abandoned or varied, as experience and circumstance shall dictate, constantly keeping in view that 'tis folly in one nation to look for disinterested favors from another, that it must pay with a portion of its independence for whatever it may accept under the character, and that by such acceptance it may place itself in the condition of having been equivalents for nominal favors and yet of being reproached with ingratitude for giving more. There can be no greater error than to expect or calculate upon real favors from nation to nation. 'Tis an illusion which experience must cure, which a just pride must discard. And so we turn the page before page 225, right in the middle there, line 15, again, George Washington, the greatest of the American founders. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. Right? So far as we have already formed engagements, let them be fulfilled with perfect good faith. But here, let us stop. We are not, as a people, built to get involved in the lives of others around the world. We welcome them. Traditionally, we have had very open borders where we welcome all of the poor of other nations. If they want to so choose and come take a chance here and make their lives in the free market of America, they are more than welcome to come. Right? Our only restriction on any immigrants coming into the United States between 1801 and 1921 was simply that they could not have tuberculosis or a criminal record and enter into the United States. Otherwise, you could come from any nation. You could be black or white or yellow. You could be from Asia or Africa or Europe or Latin America, and there were zero restrictions on you coming into the country. You could be male or female, Jewish or atheist, Catholic or Protestant. We welcomed every single people between 1801 and 1921 freely. We had completely open borders, with the exception in 1882, we had closed off our borders to China, and then in 1902 to Japan. But otherwise, and I don't think either of those things were just measures by any means. It was a formal law in 1882. It was a gentleman's agreement in 1905. That gentleman's agreement in 1905 will lead directly to World War II, though it will take a while, a good generation, but it will lead to World War II. It was a very dangerous thing that Teddy Roosevelt did. But again, I want you to bear in mind, there can be no progressivism without these kinds of insane restrictions upon certain groups of humans in opposition to other groups of humans who can benefit. But our policy had been, we keep our borders open. If you don't like your place where you live, you can come take your chances in America. Otherwise, good luck. We may send you arms, but you're going to have to take care of your own problems at home. We don't do that. That's not who we are. And again, it's not selfishness. It's prudence. We know that we don't have the ability to govern other peoples who have not been raised in a democratic way or on our Constitution or in our understanding of thinking. The fathers of the Republic planned a confederation free of peaceful industrial commonwealths, shielded by their geographical position. I'm back at William Graham Sumner. Of jealousies, rivalries, and traditional policies of the old world, and bringing all the resources of civilization to bear for the domestic happiness of our population only. This meant to have no grand statecraft or high politics, no balance of power, no reasons of state, which had cost the human race so much. They meant to offer no field for what Benjamin Franklin called the pest of glory. It is the limitation of the scheme of the state that the state created under it must forego a great number of the grand functions of European states. We're not going to have the pomp and circumstances. We're not going to have the military fanfare. We're not going to create something out of a monarch. We reject that idea as Americans, especially that it contains no methods and apparatus of conquest, extension, or domination. There's nothing in the Constitution or the Northwest Ordinance or the Declaration that allows us to be imperial. And imperialism. Let me repeat that last line there at the bottom of 563. Especially that it, the founding, contains no methods and apparatus of conquest, extension, domination, and imperialism. The plan of the founding fathers would have no controlling authority for us if it had been proved by experience that that plan was narrow, inadequate, and mistaken. Are we prepared to vote that it has proved so? For our territorial expansion has reached limits which are complete for all purposes. Right? We've made it to Rodeo Drive. End it. Any extension will open questions, not close them. Any extension will not make us more secure where we are, but will force us to take new measures to secure our new acquisitions. The preservation of acquisitions will force us to reorganize our internal resources so as to make it possible to prepare them in advance and to mobilize them with promptitude. This will lessen liberty and require discipline. It will increase taxation and all the pressures of government. Don't ever delude yourself that expansion in terms of foreign policy will ever lead to a less government here, a lesser government. It will always go together. Hence, we get that one great, horrible lesson of the American 20th century. The welfare state always expands with the warfare state, and the warfare state always expands with the welfare state. It was true in World War I, World War II, in Korea, Vietnam, and with Gulf I and Gulf II. Think about the kinds of things that you guys all take for granted when you get on an airplane, that you can be completely patted down legally by a representative of the US government under the TSA. This was stuff that did not go into effect until after the so-called Patriot Act, one of the most unpatriotic things ever passed in the history of the world, but the Patriot Act of George Bush's administration. It will divert the national energy from the provision of self-maintenance in the comfort of our people and will necessitate stronger and more elaborate governmental machinery. All this will be disastrous to Republican institutions and to democracy. Moreover, all extension puts a new strain on the internal cohesion of the pre-existing mass, threatening a new cleavage within. If we had never taken Texas and northern Mexico, we would never have had secession. The sum of the matter is that colonization and territorial expansion are burdens, not gains. Civilized states cannot avoid these burdens. They are the penalty of greatness because they are the duties of it. No state can successfully undertake to extend its jurisdiction unless its internal vitality is high, so that it has surplus energy to dispose of. Russia, as already mentioned, is a state which has taken upon itself tasks of this kind beyond its strength, and for which it is in no way competent. And of course, what will happen? The czars will collapse, and the Bolsheviks, the communists, will take over by 1917. Italy offers at this moment the strongest instance of a state which is imperiling its domestic welfare for a colonial policy which is beyond its strength. What happens? The Italian state falls apart, fascism arises. Germany has taken up a colonial policy with great eagerness, apparently from a notion that it is one of the attributes of a great state. To maintain it, she must add a great navy to her great military establishment and increase the burdens of a population which is poor and heavily taxed, and which has not its territory and great natural resources from which to draw the strength to bear its burdens. What happens? We get the Weimar Republic and then the Nazis, right? In every single case, William Graham Sumner is absolutely right in his predictions. We have the collapse of Germany, of Italy, and of Russia, and their imperial excesses of the 1890s will lead directly to the creation of their own domestic terror organizations, whether communism or National Socialism or fascism. What's the other example? Spain is exhausting her last strength to keep Cuba, which can never repay the cost unless it is treated on the old colonial plan as a subject province to be exploited for the benefit of the mother country. What happens to Spain? It completely collapses in the 1930s and goes into an open civil war between the fascists and the Bolsheviks. Right? This is incredible. Sumner nails every single one of these. He understands this is the penalty. The wages of empire are the death of your own society. Empires do not make you great. They drain you and they crush you. And this is absolutely true, not only of those places that have not the ability to wage empire because they're not strong enough, but in places like America where we may have the strength, but it would absolutely undermine the very foundations of the flag and the meaning of America and the very founding itself. But if you look on page 565 there, right next to William Graham Sumner, we have this document, and the title tells you everything. This guy is the most hardcore progressive who is also in favor of empire, a guy by the name of Albert Beveridge. And his idea is that we must have the march of the flag. And what Beveridge confirms is the confirmation again that progressivism and imperialism are always linked one to another. I guarantee you there will never be a progressive policy that is not also an imperial policy. At home at first and then abroad, or perhaps abroad at first and then at home, but the two things are always linked. All right, so September 16th of 1898, turn the page to 566. Actually, let's start at the bottom of 565. It is a noble land that God has given us, a land that can feed and clothe the world, a land whose coastlines would enclose half the countries of Europe, a land set like a sentinel between two imperial oceans of the globe, a greater England with a nobler destiny. Uh-oh. Already we better be careful. What is America? We're a greater England with a nobler destiny? Would the founders have agreed with that in any way, shape, or form, that we were a greater England, England plus, with a noble destiny? Well, maybe, but I don't think in the way that Beveridge means here. It is a mighty people that is planted on this soil, that he has planted on this soil. Can't leave God out of this, right? It's obviously God-driven from his insane perspective. A people sprung from the most masterful blood of history. A people perpetually revitalized by the virile, man-producing working folk of all the earth. A people imperial by virtue of their power. Imperial by virtue of their power. Just a little bit of a tautology there. By right of their institutions, again, what institutions of the founding would lend itself or themselves towards empire? Good question, Mr. Beveridge. By the right of their institutions, by the authority of their heaven-directed purposes. Hey, did God come tell us? Absolutely. God came down and he said, you guys need to be imperialists. That's what I made you for, right? There it is. Have fun. Go rape everybody. The propagandists and not the misers of liberty. It is the glorious history our God has bestowed upon his chosen people. Hey, not bad. A historic, heroic, with faith in our mission and our future. A history of statesmen who flung the boundaries of the Republic out into the unexplored lands and savage wilderness. A history of soldiers who carried the flag across blazing deserts and through the ranks of the hostile mountains even to the gates of sunset. A history of a multiplying people who overran a continent in half a century. A history of prophets who saw the consequences of evil inherited from the past and of the martyrs who died to save us from them. A history divinely logical. In the process of those tremendous reasoning, we find ourselves today. It's undeniable. God made us to conquer the world. Isn't that what George Washington just told us? Right? This is incredible. These progressives just make this stuff up. And they are absolutely convinced that we must remake the world in our image. And they believe they've got the God-given duty and the God-given right to do so. Therefore, in this campaign, the question is larger than a party question. It is an American question. It is a world question. Shall the American people continue their march towards the commercial supremacy of the world? Shall free institutions broaden their blessed reign as the children of liberty wax in strength, until the empire of our principles is established over the hearts of all mankind? Talk about a neocon here, right? Already, what are we trying to do? As he says, we want to establish the principles of our empire over the hearts of all mankind. Have we a mission to perform? No duty to discharge to our fellow man? Well, of course, they're all waiting there. All the Arabs, all the Africans, all the Chinese, they're just waiting. Come on, Americans, come tell us how to live. You can imagine they're sitting over there in their countries right now. Hey, what do? We don't have life, we don't have existence, we don't have culture, we don't have religion. Come tell us what to do. Americans, this is who and what you're supposed to be. Have we a mission to perform? No duty to discharge to our fellow man? Has God endowed us with gifts beyond our deserts and marked us as the people of his peculiar favor, merely to rot in our own selfishness? As men and nations must, who take cowardice for their companion and self for their deity, as China has, as India has, as Egypt has. Right? No, don't we want to be more like Imperial England or Imperial Russia or Imperial whatever, right? Isn't that what we want? Turn the page 568, and look at the bottom paragraph. The ocean does not separate us from lands of our duty and desire. The ocean joins us. Rivers, never to be dredged. Canals, never to be repaired. Steam joins us. Electricity joins us. The very elements are in league with our destiny. Cuba, not contiguous. Puerto Rico, not contiguous. Hawaii and the Philippines, not contiguous. The oceans make them contiguous, and our Navy will make them contiguous. So this is what God made the oceans for, not to separate us from all the hell and horrors of the old world, but to make us travel to the old world and undo those hells through our military and commercial policy. Now, I don't want to reference pop culture here too much, but have any of you ever played a game called BioShock Infinite? Now you might know exactly where that game came from. Let's remake the world in our image. We can create a progressive utopia here at home and abroad. Now, I do want to ask this question. Beveridge keeps telling us how selfish we are if we don't use our military for imperial purposes. But how selfish is it to allow any single person, male, female, black, white, to come to the United States, take up residence, and take property and work? Is that selfish? Is it selfish to allow anyone in the world to become an American? These are tough questions. I have very, very strong views on this, as you probably can tell. But this is amazing to me. He and the progressives are completely inverting the American project. Progressivism is the antithesis of the American founding in every way. Turn the page again onto 570. Look at the top there, that first full paragraph. The commercial supremacy of the Republic means that the nation is to be the sovereign factor in the peace of the world. For the conflicts of the future are to be conflicts of trade, struggles for markets, commercial wars for existence. And the golden rule of peace is impregnability of position and invincibility of preparedness. So we see England, the greatest strategist of history, plant her flag and her cannon on Gibraltar, Quebec, in the Bermudas, and at Vancouver, everywhere. Fascinating. We once rejected everything Britain stood for so that we could become an independent republic. Now he's telling us to forsake that entire inheritance because it's selfish, and rather imperialism is somehow, in some way, an idea that we can impose ourselves in a glorious way. Certainly we're not doing this for our own glory, but doesn't God really want us to do that? I mean, as the new chosen people, aren't we supposed to remake the world? Wow, I mean, these are interesting lessons. Okay, so turn the page again. Now we see a fascinating movement, and a movement I have to agree with would be the one that, God willing, I would have become a part of. The one that, as we see here on page 573, was called the American Anti-Imperialist League, made up of all kinds of people on the left and the right, people like William Jennings Bryan, E.L. Godkin, Andrew Carnegie, William James, William Graham Sumner, Mark Twain. And what do these people say? What is their argument? Turn to page 574. We hold that the policy known as imperialism is hostile to liberty and tends towards militarism, an evil from which it has been our glory to be free. We regret that it has become necessary in the land of Washington and Lincoln to reaffirm that all men of whatever race or color are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We maintain that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Wow, how radical. Let's re-establish the Declaration as the foundation of our definition of the human person. We insist that the subjugation of any people is criminal aggression and the open disloyalty to the distinctive principles of our government. We earnestly condemn the policy of the present national administration in the Philippines. Again, we're in a guerrilla war, and we will end up killing 60,000 Filipinos in 5 years. If that is not mass murder, I don't know what is. It seeks to extinguish the spirit of 1776 in those islands. We deplore the sacrifice of our soldiers and sailors whose bravery deserves admiration even in an unjust war. But we denounce the slaughter of the Filipinos as a needless horror. We protest against the extension of American sovereignty by Spanish methods. We demand the immediate cessation of the war against liberty begun by Spain and continued by us. We urge that Congress announce to the Filipinos our purpose to concede to them the independence for which they have so long fought and which is theirs by right. The United States have always protested against the doctrine of international law which permits the subjugation of the weak by the strong. A self-governing state cannot accept sovereignty over an unwilling people. The United States cannot act upon the ancient heresy that might makes right. Have we not learned that? Did we not learn that through the long history of the Anglo-Saxon peoples? Might does not make right. And when we pursue might over right, at that point, it is our duty to rebel against it. Imperialists assume, with the destruction of self-government in the Philippines by American hands, all opposition here will cease. This is a grievous error. Much as we abhor the war of criminal aggression in the Philippines, greatly as we regret that the blood of the Filipinos is on American hands, 60,000, we more deeply resent the betrayal of the American institutions. At home, the real firing line is not in the suburbs of Manila. The foe is our own household. The attempt of 1861 was to divide the country. That of 1899 is to destroy its fundamental principles and noblest ideals. And yes, it is the fault of the progressives. Whether the ruthless slaughter of the Filipinos shall end next month or next year is but an incident in the contest that must go on until the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States are rescued from the hands of their betrayers. These progressives are nothing but traitorous barbarians within our own gates, and we have a duty to stop all tyranny at home and abroad, right? As the U.S. Constitution, that is not to promote it at home or abroad. Those who dispute about standards of value while the foundation of the Republic is undermined will be listened to as little as those who would wrangle about the small economies of the household while the house is on fire. The training of a great people for a century, the aspiration for liberty of vast immigration. This is not selfish. It is exactly the opposite. Selfishness is invading another country. Are forces that will hurl aside those who in the delirium of conquest seek to destroy the character of our institutions. We deny that the obligation of all citizens to support their government in times of grave national peril applies to the present situation. If an administration may, with impunity, ignore the issues upon which it was chosen, deliberately create a condition of war anywhere on the face of the globe, debauch the civil service for spoils to promote the adventure, organize a truth-suppressing censorship, and demand of all citizens a suspension of judgment and of their unanimous support, while it chooses to continue the fighting, representative government is itself imperiled. We propose to contribute to the defeat of any person or party that stands for the forcible subjugation of any people. We shall oppose for re-election all who in the White House or in the Congress betray American liberty in pursuit of un-American ends. We still hope that both of our great political parties will support and defend the Declaration of Independence in the closing campaign of the century. We hold with Abraham Lincoln that no man is good enough to govern another man without the other's consent. And when the white man governs himself, that is self-government. But when he governs himself and also governs another man, that is more than self-government. That is despotism. Our reliance is on the love of liberty which God has planted in us. Our defense is in the spirit which prizes liberty as a heritage of all men in all lands. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it. We cordially invite cooperation of all men and women who remain loyal to the Declaration and the Constitution of the United States. Amen. Right? These are the real Americans in 1899. Those who understand with George Washington that our policy should not be one ever of the oppression or entanglement of our foreign policy with that of a foreign country. Rather, we must maintain our independence. And this is going to beg questions, because not only are we going to get involved in World War I, but we will in World War II, afterwards, before with the League of Nations, after with the United Nations, with NATO. It is very unclear how constitutional these all are. But I want to remind you, the 1890s, 1900s, and 19-teens are full of war. So it's not as though suddenly Woodrow Wilson brought us, and I am not a fan of Wilson by any means, but it's not as though he suddenly brought World War I upon us. This had been building all for the 30 years prior to World War I. Again, in our war in the Philippines beginning in 1898, but then, as I've already stated, in our invasions of Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua, Mexico repeatedly. And we also sent troops into North Africa during this time under Teddy Roosevelt. We're gun happy. This becomes a major policy of the progressive era. Okay, that is probably a good place to stop. So I think we've reached our time period here, our time limit, I should say. So for the next class, for Wednesday's class, I would like you to read the pieces that we have from Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. I would also like you to read William James's essay on pragmatism. Okay? So Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and William James. And after we do that, I'd like you to read Calvin Coolidge. So this is all coming up in the next few days, the next few classes. Again, I hope you had a truly blessed Easter. I hope that you are all doing well and staying safe. And may God bless you. I'll see you in 2 days.